Dear listener, tonight we journey to 1858, to the grand estates of Hampshire and the ancient halls of Ashworth Abbey. If you have ever felt invisible in your own life, if you have ever been forced to make yourself small in spaces that should belong to you, if you have ever wondered whether anyone truly sees your worth beneath the role they've assigned you, this story is for you. Close your eyes, and let me tell you about Lady Catherine Ashworth, the Duke's daughter who scrubbed floors in her own home. Winter, 1858. The frost settled over Ashworth Abbey like a judgment, coating the ancient stone walls in crystalline silence. The estate had stood since the reign of Henry VIII, its towers watching over 5,000 acres of Hampshire countryside, its name synonymous with power and nobility for 3 centuries. But in the kitchen, where the heat from the massive iron stove barely touched the stone floors, a young woman knelt with a scrubbing brush, her hands raw and bleeding from the lye soapy. Lady Catherine Ashworth, at 24, possessed hands that told 2 stories. Her fingers were long and elegant, the hands of someone born to hold a pen or a teacup. But they were covered in burns and cuts, calluses that had formed over 5 years of labor. She knelt on the kitchen floor at 4 in the morning, as she did every morning, scrubbing the flagstones before the rest of the household stirred. Her dark hair, once carefully dressed by a lady's maid, was now pulled back in a simple knot. Her dress was rough gray wool, patched at the elbows. But those who looked closely, and no one did, might have noticed the perfect straightness of her spine even as she knelt, the way she held her head despite her degraded position, and most of all, the intelligence that burned in her gray eyes like banked coals. Lady Catherine should have been the Duchess of Ashworth. Her father, the 8th Duke, had died 5 years ago, leaving everything to his only legitimate child, her. Instead, she was called Kate by the servants, treated as a charity case, a poor relation taken in out of obligation. The woman who now called herself the Dowager Duchess, her father's second wife, married only 2 years before his death, ruled the abbey with absolute control. And Catherine, the true heir, scrubbed the floors of her own home. The kitchen door opened, letting in a blast of winter air. Mrs. Bellingham, the housekeeper who had served the Ashworth family for 30 years, stepped in quietly. She glanced at Catherine with the same expression she'd worn for 5 years, a mixture of pain and helplessness. "The fires need laying in the drawing room," Mrs. Bellingham said softly, the formal instruction barely masking the apology in her voice. "Her Grace will be receiving callers this afternoon." Catherine stood, wiping her raw hands on her apron. "Yes, Mrs. Bellingham." The housekeeper lingered, her weathered face troubled. "Your hands, child. They're bleeding again. They'll heal," Catherine said, her voice carrying the same measured dignity it always did, no matter the task she was performing. "They always do." Mrs. Bellingham pressed her lips together, 1,000 unsaid words trapped behind them, and left. Catherine watched her go, then looked down at her hands. 5 years of this. 5 years of scrubbing, hauling, serving. 5 years of being invisible in the home where she'd been born, where her ancestors' portraits lined the galleries, where her father had taught her Latin and law and the complete history of their lineage. She remembered the day it had all changed. The day of her father's funeral, when Harriet, the woman her father had married in what Catherine now understood was a moment of loneliness and poor judgment, had taken her aside in the library. "Your father's will was quite clear," Harriet had said, her voice honey-sweet and utterly false. "He left the estate and title to pass through the male line. Since there are no male heirs, the estate reverts to distant cousins. However, in his generosity, He made provisions for you. You're to be cared for here as a companion to the household. Catherine, 19 and drowning in grief, had believed her. Why wouldn't she? Harriet had shown her a document, official-looking, sealed, convincing, and Catherine, for all her education, had never actually seen her father's will. He'd been only 48 when he died suddenly of a heart condition. They'd had no time to prepare. Of course, you understand your position now, Harriet had continued. The estate cannot support idle hands. You'll be expected to earn your keep. It's what your father would have wanted, for you to learn humility and industry. And so it had begun. First as a lady's companion, then as a maid, then lower still, until Catherine found herself in the kitchens, performing the hardest and most menial labor. The transformation had been gradual enough that society hadn't noticed. The Duke's daughter had simply faded from view, and in her place was Kate, the poor relation, barely worth remembering. But Catherine remembered everything. Every word her father had spoken to her. Every lesson in heraldry and law. Every evening spent in his study, learning the history of their family, the sacred responsibility of their position. The Duke of Ashworth was not merely a title. It was a legacy of service, of land held in trust, of obligations to tenants and tradition. And she remembered something else. Something Harriet didn't know Catherine had witnessed. 2 weeks before her father's death, Catherine had been in the gallery late at night, unable to sleep. She'd heard voices from her father's study, her father's voice and Harriet's. She'd moved closer to the door, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to help herself when she heard her own name. Catherine is to inherit everything, her father had said firmly. I've made it abundantly clear in my will. The estate, the title, as far as it can pass to a female heir, the fortune, all of it. She's been raised for this responsibility. But your cousins, Harriet had begun, are not my children. Catherine is my heir. My solicitor has everything documented. When I die, she becomes the Duchess of Ashworth in her own right. It's unusual, but it's legal, and it's my wish. Catherine had been standing in the hall, her heart swelling with pride and fear in equal measure, when Harriet had emerged from the study. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and Catherine had seen something in Harriet's face that had made her blood run cold. But she'd been 19, grieving, and she'd pushed the memory aside. Now, 5 years later, Catherine understood what she'd seen in Harriet's eyes that night. Calculation. Catherine carried the coal scuttle up the servants' stairs, her back aching from the weight. The drawing room was on the second floor, with windows that overlooked the park. She'd played in that room as a child, had learned to embroider there with her mother before consumption had taken her when Catherine was 12. Her father had never remarried until Harriet, and Catherine had thought she understood why. He'd loved her mother too much to replace her. She'd been wrong. He'd simply been careful. And then, in his middle age, lonely and perhaps less cautious, he'd met Harriet Thornton at a house party. Harriet had been a widow, she'd claimed, of a minor gentleman. She'd been handsome, charming, appropriately modest. She'd shown no sign of the calculating creature she truly was. Catherine laid the fire, her movements practiced and efficient. Through the drawing room windows, she could see the park dusted with snow. Her father had walked with her there every Sunday after church, discussing philosophy and history and his hopes for her future. You must be strong, Catherine, he'd told her once when she was 16. The world is not kind to women who think. But thinking is your greatest gift. Never let anyone make you ashamed of your mind. She'd tried to honor that, even as she'd been pushed lower and lower in the household hierarchy. Even as Harriet had made it clear that questions about the estate, the finances, or the will would result in harsher treatment. Even as Catherine had watched Harriet install her own son, a coarse, stupid boy named William, who Harriet claimed was from her first marriage, as the nominal heir to the estate. William Thornton was 26 now, and as far as Catherine could tell, had never read a book or performed an honest day's work in his life. He lived off the estate's income, gambling and drinking in London, while Harriet ruled Ashworth Abbey with absolute control. The fire laid, Catherine was about to return to the kitchen when she heard voices in the hallway. She moved quickly to the servant's door, knowing better than to be seen by her stepmother's guests. But as she reached for the door handle, she heard Harriet's voice, sharp with irritation. "I don't care who the Duke of Thornfield is or what his business with my late husband might have been. I have no interest in discussing estate matters with strangers. I assure you, Your Grace, my business is quite legitimate." The man's voice was deep, cultured, carrying an edge of steel beneath the politeness. "The 8th Duke and I had mutual investments. I've only recently returned from India, and I was hoping to review some documents related to our partnership. All such matters are handled by my solicitor. I suggest you contact him." "I've attempted to do so. He seems remarkably difficult to reach." "Then perhaps, Your Grace, you might take the hint that your business is concluded." There was a pause, heavy with tension. Catherine found herself frozen by the door, hardly breathing. "Perhaps," the man said slowly, "you might take the hint that I'm not easily discouraged. I'll call again, madam, and I'll continue calling until my questions are answered." Footsteps moved away. Harriet's sharp heels retreating quickly, and then a heavier tread, a man's boots, moving more slowly, as if their owner was observing everything around him with careful attention. Catherine waited until silence returned, then slipped through the servant's door and down the narrow stairs. Her heart was beating strangely fast. A duke who had business with her father? Who was being blocked from accessing the estate's records? It might mean nothing. It probably meant nothing. But Catherine had learned over 5 years to notice every detail, to store away every piece of information that might, someday, prove useful. In the kitchen, Cook was beginning the day's baking, her face flushed from the heat of the oven. She glanced at Catherine with sympathy. "Your hands are a state, girl. Here." She pressed a jar of salve into Catherine's palm. "Don't let her see you with it, mind. She'll say you're putting on airs." "Thank you, Cook. Your father was a good man," Cook said quietly, her back to the room so no one else could hear. "He'd be that angry if he could see what's become of you." Catherine said nothing. What was there to say? She took the salve and escaped to the scullery, where she could apply it to her bleeding hands in private. But as she worked the ointment into her raw skin, she found herself thinking about the man's voice. The Duke of Thornfield. She knew that name. Her father had mentioned him, a man of impeccable reputation, known for his business acumen and his refusal to tolerate dishonesty in any form. And he was asking questions about the estate. For the first time in 5 years, Catherine felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. That evening, in the servants' hall, Catherine ate her dinner in silence while the other servants gossiped. She'd learned to make herself invisible even here, to fade into the background while information flowed around her. "Did you see him?" Mary, one of the housemaids, was saying. The Duke of Thornfield, I mean. Tall as a tree he was, and dark. Handsome in a stern sort of way. Her Grace sent him packing quick enough, said John the footman. You should have heard her. I have no interest in your business, Your Grace. Like she was talking to a tradesman instead of a peer. Bold, Mrs. Bellingham said quietly. Very bold. The Duke of Thornfield is not a man to dismiss lightly. Why's he poking around anyway? Mary asked. The old Duke's been dead 5 years. Investment matters, he said. John helped himself to more bread. But if you ask me, he looked like a man who'd found something that didn't smell right and meant to get to the bottom of it. Catherine kept her eyes on her plate, but every nerve was alert. An investigation. Someone from outside the estate, someone with power and influence, asking questions that Harriet didn't want answered. After dinner, Catherine returned to her tiny room in the attics, a space barely larger than a closet with a narrow bed and a single small window. She'd once had a suite of rooms on the family floor, with a sitting room and a lady's maid and a wardrobe full of beautiful gowns. Now she owned 2 gray dresses and this rough nightgown. But she also owned something Harriet didn't know about. Catherine knelt beside her bed and carefully pried up a loose floorboard. Hidden beneath it was a small wooden box, and inside that box were the treasures she'd managed to save from her old life. A miniature portrait of her mother, a few letters from her father, a book of family heraldry that had been in her room when her father died, which she'd hidden before Harriet could confiscate it. And one more thing, a signet ring, her father's ring, bearing the Ashworth coat of arms. She'd taken it from his hand before they'd closed the coffin, unable to bear the thought of it being buried with him. It was too large for her fingers, so she'd worn it on a chain around her neck ever since, hidden beneath her dress. Catherine pulled out the heraldry book and opened it to the page showing the Ashworth arms. Quarterly, 1st and 4th, azure, a lion rampant or, 2nd and 3rd, gules, 3 roses argent. The motto beneath read, Veritas vincit, truth conquers. Her father had taught her to read heraldry when she was 8 years old. By the time she was 12, she could identify any arms in the peerage on sight and recite the history of how they'd been granted. It was an unusual skill for a woman, but her father had been raising her to understand every aspect of her inheritance. Knowledge is power, Catherine, he'd told her, and the day may come when you need every bit of knowledge you possess. She traced the lions and roses with one finger, her raw skin catching on the old paper. The Duke of Thornfield was asking questions, and Harriet was desperate to prevent him from getting answers, which meant there were answers worth hiding. Catherine closed the book carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Then she lay down on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking, 5 years she'd been patient. 5 years she'd made herself small, invisible, unremarkable. 5 years she'd waited because she'd had no choice, no ally, no way to fight back against a woman who controlled everything and everyone in this household. But perhaps, just perhaps, that was about to change. If the Duke of Thornfield came back, and that voice had suggested he would, then Catherine needed to be ready. She needed to find a way to speak with him, to tell him what she knew, to offer him the pieces of the puzzle that only she possessed. It was dangerous. If Harriet discovered her plans, the consequences would be severe. Catherine had learned over 5 years that her stepmother's cruelty had no bottom, no limit. But for the first time in 5 years, Catherine felt a spark of the person she'd once been. The girl her father had raised to be strong, to think clearly, to never surrender to injustice. Truth conquers, the Ashworth motto proclaimed. Perhaps it was time to put that to the test. You see, dear listener, this was the moment everything began to shift. Not because a duke arrived to rescue Catherine, he didn't, not yet. But because Catherine herself began to wake from the numbness that had kept her surviving. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply decide that we will no longer accept the unacceptable. That we will stop waiting for salvation and start planning our own. The next morning brought another frost and another day of labor. Catherine rose at 4, as always, and made her way down to the kitchen. But as she worked, her mind was racing, planning, calculating. She needed to speak with the Duke of Thornfield. But how? She was never allowed beyond the servants' areas during the day. Harriet made sure of that, keeping Catherine well away from any visitors who might recognize that the maid Kate was actually Lady Catherine Ashworth. The answer came to her as she was hauling water from the well. The Duke had said he would call again, and when he did, Catherine would need to be somewhere she could intercept him, somewhere she had a legitimate reason to be. The library. Harriet rarely used the library. She wasn't a reader, and the sight of so many books seemed to irritate her. But it would need cleaning, especially if Harriet thought the Duke might insist on a meeting there. And cleaning the library was a task that could take hours, providing Catherine with both a legitimate excuse for being there and the opportunity to wait for the Duke's next visit. All she had to do was volunteer for a job that everyone else hated. At breakfast in the servants' hall, Catherine spoke up for the first time in months. "Mrs. Bellingham, I noticed the library needs a thorough cleaning. I could do it today if you like." The housekeeper looked surprised. The library was a massive room with floor-to-ceiling shelves, thousands of books, and decades of accumulated dust in the upper reaches. It was a miserable job that usually took 2 people an entire day. "On your own?" Mrs. Bellingham asked doubtfully. "I don't mind," Catherine said quietly. I'm good with books. I'll be careful with them." Mary, the housemaid, looked relieved. "I was supposed to start it today, Mrs. Bellingham. But if Kate wants to do it..." "Very well," the housekeeper said. "You'll need the tall ladder from the storage room. And mind you don't damage anything. Her Grace is particular about that room, even if she never uses it." Catherine nodded and kept her expression neutral. But inside, she felt that small flame of hope burn a little brighter. The library was exactly as Catherine remembered it, and nothing like it at all. The books were the same, the massive fireplace, the leather chairs where her father had spent his evenings. But dust cloths covered most of the furniture now, and there was a stillness to the room that spoke of neglect. This had been her favorite room in the house. Here, her father had taught her history and philosophy, had read to her from ancient texts, had shared his love of learning. Here, she'd become the person she truly was, a person who now had to hide behind a maid's dress and downcast eyes. Catherine began with the lower shelves, dusting carefully, aware that she might need to make this job last several days if necessary. She worked slowly, methodically, and tried not to let the memories overwhelm her. She'd been dusting for perhaps an hour when she heard voices in the hallway. Her pulse quickened. She recognized Harriet's sharp tones, and beneath it, that deep male voice she'd heard yesterday. "I assure you, Your Grace, there's nothing in the library that would interest you. Nevertheless, I'd like to see it. The 8th Duke and I discussed his collection on several occasions. I promised him I'd examine a particular volume if I were ever in Hampshire. I'm afraid I don't. It will only take a moment." The library door opened. Catherine, perched on the tall ladder with a duster in her hand, froze. She was facing away from the door, her position perfectly legitimate. Just a maid doing her work. but her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might be audible. Harriet's voice was tight with irritation. "As you can see, the room is being cleaned. Perhaps another time. I don't mind a bit of dust." The Duke's footsteps entered the room, firm and unhurried. "Thank you, Your Grace. I can find my own way out." It was a dismissal, politely phrased, but utterly clear. Catherine, still facing the shelves, held her breath. Would Harriet leave? Or would she stay, suspicious, watching? "Very well," Harriet said after a long pause. 5 minutes, Your Grace. I have other matters to attend to." The door closed. Catherine heard the Duke's footsteps move across the room, the rustle of dust cloths being moved aside. She continued her dusting, her movements careful and steady, while her mind raced. Should she speak? Should she stay silent? What if Harriet was listening at the door? "Interesting," the Duke said, his voice thoughtful. "I was told this room was never used. Yet I see someone has been caring for the books quite meticulously. This volume here, Blackstone's Commentaries, has been recently handled, and the heraldic reference section appears to have been accessed regularly." Catherine's hand stilled on the shelf. He was observing, noticing details, and he was speaking loudly enough that his words felt deliberate, as if he wanted her to hear them. "The 8th Duke," he continued, moving closer to where Catherine stood on the ladder, "was a great believer in education. He once told me he'd given his daughter the finest education a woman could receive. Latin, law, history, heraldry. He was immensely proud of her mind." Catherine's throat tightened. She gripped the ladder to steady herself. "I wonder," the Duke said softly, now directly behind her, "what became of Lady Catherine Ashworth? The Duke spoke of her constantly, yet when I inquire in the county, no one seems to know where she is. It's as if she vanished after her father's death." He knew. Somehow, he knew. Catherine turned slowly on the ladder, and for the first time in 5 years, she looked a man of her own class directly in the eye. He was tall, as Mary had said, with dark hair shot through with gray at the temples. His face was strong-featured, handsome in a severe way, with eyes that were intensely blue and uncomfortably perceptive. He wore his wealth and position with natural authority. But there was something else in his expression as he looked up at her, a sharp intelligence that missed nothing. Their eyes met, and Catherine saw the exact moment he understood. "My God," he said quietly. "It's you." Catherine descended the ladder carefully, aware that her hands were shaking. When she reached the bottom, she curtsied, the proper curtsy of an equal, not a servant, and met his gaze again. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but steady, "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. You seem to know who I am, but I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Richard Blackwood, Duke of Thornfield." His eyes never left her face. "I knew your father. We served together on several parliamentary committees, and we had business investments in common. He spoke of you often. He paused, something like anger flashing across his face. "He was planning to introduce us at the season of 1854. But then he died, and you disappeared. And when I returned from India last month, I discovered that the Ashworth estate had been systematically plundered, and that you were nowhere to be found." Catherine's breath caught. "Plundered? Your stepmother has been embezzling from the estate for 5 years. She sold off properties, diverted rents, and falsified accounts. I only discovered it because some of the properties she sold were ones your father and I held jointly. When I investigated, I found a trail of financial irregularities that would make a solicitor weep. The will, Catherine said urgently. Did you find my father's will? No. That's what I've been trying to locate. Your stepmother claims it's with the family solicitor, but the solicitor seems to have vanished. I believe she's paid him to disappear, along with the original will. Catherine's mind was racing. 5 years of waiting, of endurance, of careful observation. And now, finally, someone who could help. Someone with the power and the will to investigate. But also someone who could be in danger if Harriet realized what he knew. Your Grace, she said quietly, you need to be careful. My stepmother is not just greedy. She's dangerous. People who have questioned her authority have had accidents, or have suddenly left the area, or have been discredited so thoroughly that no one believes them. If she realizes you're investigating her, I'm a duke, Lady Catherine. She can't touch me. She's had 5 years to build her position. She has allies purchased with stolen money, and she's desperate. Catherine glanced toward the door. How long has it been since she left? Long enough? He moved closer, his voice dropping. Lady Catherine, I need your help. You've lived in this house for 5 years. You must have seen things, heard things, noticed discrepancies. I need evidence. Concrete proof that can stand up in court. I have some, Catherine said. Hidden in my room. Letters from my father, a heraldry book, his signet ring. But Your Grace, you need to understand. I'm not free to just leave this house. I'm watched constantly. If I suddenly disappear with you, Harriet will know something is wrong. She might destroy evidence, or flee, or... Then we'll be careful. His blue eyes were intense, focused entirely on her in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in 5 years. Can you get me the items you mentioned tonight? How? The garden door on the east side. It's usually unlocked for the groundskeeper. Can you reach it? Catherine thought quickly. The servants' stairs led down to a passage that connected to the kitchens, and from there she could reach the scullery, which had a door to the kitchen garden. From the kitchen garden, it was a short walk to the east side of the house. Yes, she said. Midnight. Everyone will be asleep by then. I'll be there. He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand, her raw, work-damaged hand, in his. His touch was gentle, but his grip was firm. Lady Catherine, I give you my word. I will not stop until justice is served. Your father was my friend, and what has been done to you is unconscionable. Catherine felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been locked away for 5 years. Not quite tears, not quite relief. Something closer to recognition. Why? She asked. Why do you care? You could have walked away, forgotten about the investments, let this all remain hidden. Because I knew your father, he said simply. And because I saw your portrait in the gallery yesterday. The one painted when you were 20. You were wearing a blue dress, and you were holding a book. And your father was standing beside you, his hand on your shoulder. The pride in his face was unmistakable. His voice roughened. And then I asked where you were, and your stepmother told me you died in a carriage accident shortly after your father's death. She lied to my face without flinching. She's told that lie to everyone, Catherine said bitterly. I've been dead for 5 years, according to society, which makes it quite convenient that I'm actually here, scrubbing her floors. Not for much longer. He released her hand, but his eyes held hers. Midnight, Lady Catherine. And be careful. If she suspects, I've been careful for 5 years, Your Grace. I can manage 1 more day. He nodded, then moved toward the door. But before he left, he turned back. "Your father told me once that you had a mind sharper than any barrister he'd ever met. He said you could recite the complete peerage from memory and identify any coat of arms in England. Is that true?" "Yes," Catherine said. "Good." A slight smile crossed his stern face. "We're going to need that mind. Your stepmother has made mistakes, Lady Catherine. People like her always do. And you're going to help me find every single one." He left, and Catherine stood alone in the library, her heart pounding, her mind already racing ahead to what needed to be done. She returned to her dusting, moving the ladder, working with mechanical precision while her thoughts churned. Evidence. She needed to gather everything that might prove her identity and Harriet's fraud. The letters, the ring, the heraldry book. But what else? The afternoon passed in a blur. Catherine worked in the library until dinner, then returned to the servants' hall, forcing herself to eat, to behave normally, to give no sign that anything had changed. But everything had changed. After 5 years of patient endurance, she was finally fighting back. That night, Catherine lay in her narrow bed, fully dressed, waiting. The house settled into silence slowly. She heard Harriet retire to her chambers at 11, heard William stumble in drunk at past, heard the servants' footsteps fade as everyone sought their beds. At midnight, Catherine rose. She retrieved her wooden box from beneath the floorboard, checked its contents, then wrapped it carefully in a cloth. She'd added one more item this afternoon, a page torn from the household accounts book, which she'd found in the library desk. It showed discrepancies between what was recorded as spent and what had actually been purchased. Small proof, perhaps, but it was something. The servants' stairs were pitch dark. Catherine navigated them by memory, her feet silent on the worn wood. Through the kitchen, moving slowly past Cook's sleeping form by the banked fire. Into the scullery, where the night air leaked in around the ill-fitted door. She'd oiled the hinges that afternoon as part of her cleaning. Now the door opened soundlessly, and Catherine slipped out into the winter night. The kitchen garden was silvered with frost, every plant and path edged in white. Catherine's breath steamed in the air as she hurried across it, clutching her bundle. The east side of the house was darker, shadowed by the old yew trees that had stood there for centuries. A figure detached from the shadows. Lady Catherine. She nearly gasped, then recognized the Duke's voice. He was dressed in dark clothes, practical for moving unseen, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew how to navigate difficult situations. "I have everything I could safely take," Catherine said, holding out the bundle. "Letters from my father that mention his intentions for my inheritance, his signet ring with the family arms, their heraldry book. And this." She pulled out the account page. Evidence of financial manipulation. There are more like it. But I couldn't take them without being noticed. The Duke took the bundle, examining each item quickly in the faint moonlight. When he opened the heraldry book and saw the Ashworth arms, his jaw tightened. "Your father showed me this book once," he said quietly. "He told me you'd memorized every page." He looked at her. "Lady Catherine, I'm going to London tomorrow. I'm going to find your father's solicitor, the real one, not the man your stepmother has paid off. I'm going to locate the original will, and I'm going to build a case that your stepmother cannot refute." "How long will that take?" 3 weeks, perhaps a month." "Can you hold on that long?" Catherine thought of 5 years. 1 more month seemed both impossibly long and laughably short. "Yes," she said. "But, Your Grace, you should know. Harriet is planning something. I overheard her talking to William yesterday. She's arranging a marriage for him, to the daughter of a viscount, a girl with a large dowry. If that marriage happens, if William gets his hands on more money, I'll stop it." The Duke's voice was hard. "I'll make sure every solicitor and father in England knows that William Thornton is not the heir to anything, and that marrying him would be marrying a fraud." "Be careful," Catherine said urgently. "She's more dangerous than you think." "So am I." He looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite name. Respect, certainly. Determination. But also something warmer. Something that made her breath catch. "You're extraordinary, do you know that? 5 years of this, and you haven't broken. You haven't lost yourself. You're still fighting." "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice. You could have given up. Accepted it. Let yourself become what she wanted you to be. But you didn't." He reached out and very gently touched her cheek. His hand was warm against her cold skin. "Hold on a little longer, Lady Catherine. I promise you, this will end. And when it does, you will stand before everyone who doubted you, and they will see exactly who you are." Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows, taking her small bundle of proof with him. Catherine stood alone in the winter garden, her heart pounding, her cheek still warm from his touch. For the first time in 5 years, she let herself imagine it. Not just freedom, but vindication. Not just escape, but justice. She returned to the house as silently as she'd left it, climbed the dark stairs, and lay down in her narrow bed. But sleep didn't come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and let herself think about what came next. The Duke of Thornfield had seen her. Not Kate the maid, but Lady Catherine Ashworth. And he'd looked at her as if she mattered, as if she were worth fighting for. After 5 years of being invisible, that recognition felt like waking from a long, cold dream. Morning came too soon. Catherine rose at 4, as always, and began her day's labor. But now, every task had a different quality. She was no longer just enduring. She was waiting, preparing, gathering her strength for what was coming. In the servants' hall at breakfast, Mrs. Bellingham looked troubled. "Her Grace is in a temper this morning," she warned. "The Duke of Thornfield left for London at dawn, and she's been raging about it. Says he's trying to cause trouble, stirring up old business that should be left buried." "Left buried?" John the footman said darkly. "That's one way of putting it." Mrs. Bellingham shot him a sharp look. "Mind your tongue. Walls have ears." But the look she gave Catherine was significant. The household staff knew something was wrong. They'd known for years. They were simply powerless to stop it. The Costure, days that followed, were tense. Harriet's temper was volatile, swinging between fury and anxiety. She sent letters constantly, to solicitors, to William in London, to various men whose names Catherine didn't recognize, but whose purposes she could guess. Harriet was shoring up her position, preparing for the Duke's investigation, which meant the Duke was succeeding in making her nervous. Catherine kept her head down and her eyes open. She listened at doors when she could, memorized names and details, and noted every discrepancy she spotted in the household accounts. The cook was ordering food for 12, but being charged for provisions for 20. The coal merchant's bills showed deliveries that never arrived. The monthly wages for staff members who didn't exist. It was all there, a pattern of theft so extensive that Catherine marveled Harriet had gotten away with it for so long. But of course, Harriet had controlled the narrative. With Catherine declared dead, with the solicitor disappeared. With the estate's books sealed from outside scrutiny, there had been no one to question her, no one with the standing and the will to investigate. Until now. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Catherine began to wonder if something had gone wrong. Had the Duke been unable to find the will? Had Harriet's agent stopped him somehow? But then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, everything changed. Catherine was in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner, when Mrs. Bellingham burst in, her face flushed. "Kate, you're wanted in the drawing room, immediately." Catherine's heart stopped. The drawing room. But now, girl, Her Grace's orders. Catherine set down her knife with trembling hands, wiped her palms on her apron, and followed Mrs. Bellingham up the servants' stairs. Her mind was racing. Had Harriet discovered something? Was she about to be thrown out, or worse? Mrs. Bellingham paused at the drawing room door. "Whatever happens," she whispered, remember you're stronger than she is. Remember who you really are." Then she opened the door, and Catherine stepped through. The drawing room was full of people. Harriet stood by the fireplace, her face pale and tight with fury. William lounged in a chair, looking confused and hungover. And standing by the windows, holding a sheaf of documents, was the Duke of Thornfield. He looked at Catherine, and his expression was fierce with triumph. "Lady Catherine Ashworth," he said formally, "I'm glad you could join us. I've been explaining to the Dowager Duchess, or rather, to Mrs. Harriet Thornton, as she should properly be called, that her tenure at Ashworth Abbey is over." "This is ridiculous," Harriet spat. "This girl is a servant. She's not. She is the legitimate daughter of the 8th Duke of Ashworth and the rightful heir to this estate." The Duke's voice cut through Harriet's protests like a blade. "I have her birth certificate, signed by her father and witnessed by 3 peers of the realm. I have your late husband's will, retrieved from the solicitor you paid to disappear, who was quite willing to testify once he understood the penalties for document fraud. And I have 5 years of financial records that show systematic embezzlement of estate funds." He turned to Catherine. "Lady Catherine, would you be so kind as to recite the Ashworth lineage from the 1st Duke to the 8th? Catherine understood. This was a test, proof of her identity that couldn't be faked. She stepped forward and in a clear, steady voice began. "The 1st Duke of Ashworth was created by King Henry VIII in 1542. Awarded to Sir Robert Ashworth for services rendered to the crown during the dissolution of the monasteries. The 2nd Duke, Thomas Ashworth, served Queen Elizabeth as ambassador to France. The 3rd Duke, William Ashworth, was a noted scholar who..." She continued through 8 generations, reciting dates of birth and death, marriages, children, titles, and services to the crown. It took 5 minutes, and she never hesitated once. When she finished, the room was silent. "No impostor could do that," the Duke said quietly. "No one but the woman who was raised from childhood to know every detail of her family's history. Lady Catherine Ashworth, the 9th Duchess of Ashworth in her own right, by the explicit terms of her father's will." Harriet's face was white. "This is absurd. She's a servant. She's been working here for 5 years as a maid. Why would the Duke's daughter..." "Because you forced her to," the Duke said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You concealed the will. You told her she had no inheritance. You systematically degraded her position until she was working in your kitchens, You committed fraud, embezzlement, and criminal mistreatment of a peer of the realm. Prove it, Harriet said. You have no witnesses. It's your word against mine. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, we have rather a lot of witnesses. Catherine turned. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man in a solicitor's black, and behind him, Mrs. Bellingham, cook, and several other servants. Mr. Pemberton, the Duke said, thank you for coming. My Lord Duke, Your Grace. The solicitor bowed to both the Duke and Catherine. I was the 8th Duke's solicitor for 30 years. I prepared his will, which explicitly names his daughter Catherine as his sole heir, with the title and estate to pass to her upon his death. Mrs. Thornton approached me after the Duke's death and offered me a substantial sum to lose the will and support her claim that the estate passed to distant male cousins, with herself as dowager guardian. I'm ashamed to say I accepted. Why the change of heart? Harriet demanded. Because the Duke of Thornfield tracked me down in Edinburgh and explained the document fraud carries a penalty of transportation. Pemberton said dryly, and because I've spent 5 years with a guilty conscience, knowing I helped destroy an innocent woman's life. As for witnesses to Lady Catherine's treatment, Mrs. Bellingham stepped forward. Every servant in this house can testify that the girl you called Kate is Lady Catherine Ashworth, the former Duke's daughter. We've watched for 5 years as you degraded her, worked her like a slave, and made her invisible in her own home. We were too frightened to speak before, but we're speaking now. You're all dismissed, Harriet said shrilly. Get out of my house. It's not your house, Catherine said quietly. Every eye turned to her. It's mine. It always was. My father left it to me, along with the title, the lands, and the fortune you've been stealing from for 5 years. She walked forward, and with each step, she felt something changing. The maid's posture falling away, the downcast eyes lifting, the voice that had been trained to stay soft and deferential, strengthening into something else entirely. For 5 years, Catherine said, I've scrubbed the floors of my own home. I've served in my own kitchen. I've lived in an attic room while you occupied my mother's chambers. I did it because I had no choice, no ally, no way to fight back. But I never forgot who I was. I never stopped being Lady Catherine Ashworth. She stopped directly in front of Harriet. They were nearly the same height, but Catherine stood straighter, and something in her bearing made Harriet take an involuntary step back. You're going to leave Ashworth Abbey today, Catherine said. You and your son. You're going to return every penny you've stolen, or you're going to face criminal prosecution, and you're never going to set foot on my land again. You can't do this, Harriet whispered. I'm the Dowager Duchess. You were never a duchess, the Duke of Thornfield said. Your marriage to the 8th Duke was illegal. He was still married to his first wife when he married you. The room went absolutely silent. That's impossible, Harriet said. His first wife died. She did, the Duke agreed. 3 months after your supposed marriage, which means your marriage never existed. You were his mistress, not his wife, and William is your son, but not the Duke's, which means you have no claim to this estate, this title, or this family's name. The color drained from Harriet's face. Catherine watched her stepmother's world crumble with the same dispassion she'd learned over 5 years of servitude. How did you find out? Harriet asked hoarsely. Your mistake was selling the India Company shares, the Duke said. Those shares were held jointly between the late Duke and myself, with specific clauses about inheritance. When you tried to sell them, it triggered an investigation. And once I started looking into your background, Mrs. Thornton, I found quite a lot, including the fact that you were already married when you wed the Duke to a man who's very much alive and very interested in claiming his share of the money you've stolen." Harriet swayed. For a moment, Catherine thought she might faint. Then her face hardened into something ugly and desperate. "You think you've won," she said to Catherine. "You think this is over. But you're a woman, alone, trying to manage an estate this size. They'll tear you apart. Society will never accept a woman with a title in her own right. You'll be devoured." "She won't be alone," the Duke of Thornfield said quietly. "She'll have my support, my resources, and my protection. I promised her father I'd watch over his daughter if anything happened to him. I failed that promise for 5 years, but I won't fail it again." He looked at Catherine, and in his eyes she saw not just respect, but something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. "Lady Catherine," he said, "I'd like to formally request permission to call upon you, to offer my counsel as you take up your responsibilities here, and to see if perhaps what I feel might be returned." The room seemed to hold its breath. Catherine looked at this man who had fought for her, who had tracked down the truth, who had seen her at her lowest point and still looked at her as if she were worth everything. "Permission granted, Your Grace," she said softly. "And yes, it is returned." Harriet made a sound of disgust. "This is absurd. You're in love with a scullery maid." "I'm in love with the strongest, most intelligent woman I've ever met," the Duke said. "The fact that she's also a duchess is merely a pleasant addition." "Get out," Catherine said to Harriet. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave this house. If you're not gone by then, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Harriet opened her mouth as if to argue, then seemed to see something in Catherine's face that silenced her. She turned and swept from the room, William stumbling after her, and Catherine heard her footsteps echoing down the hall, moving away from the life she'd tried to steal, back to whatever small existence awaited a woman exposed as a fraud and a thief. When they were gone, the servants erupted in quiet celebration. Mrs. Bellingham was crying, Cook was beaming, and even Mr. Pemberton looked relieved. The Duke was giving instructions about legal proceedings and estate management, his voice calm and competent. But Catherine just stood in the center of her drawing room, and felt the weight of 5 years lift from her shoulders. She was Lady Catherine Ashworth again, the 9th Duchess of Ashworth. Mistress of this house, this estate, this legacy her father had left her, and she was free. That evening, after Harriet and William had been escorted from the property, after the solicitor had departed with promises to begin sorting out the legal tangles, after the servants had finally stopped celebrating and returned to their duties, Catherine stood in her father's study, her study now, and looked at the portrait on the wall. Her father, in his ducal robes, painted 10 years ago. He looked stern in the portrait, but she remembered his smile, his laugh, his patient instruction. "I did it, Papa," she whispered. "I held on. I didn't break. And truth conquered, just like our motto says. He'd be proud of you." She turned. The Duke of Thornfield stood in the doorway, his severe face gentled by the lamplight. "I'd like to think so," Catherine said. He came into the room, closing the door behind him. Improper, but they were past such concerns now. "Catherine, may I speak plainly?" "Please." "I came to Ashworth Abbey on business. I intended to sort out some investment questions and leave. But then I saw your portrait, and your stepmother lied about your death, and I couldn't let it go. The more I investigated, the angrier I became. What she did to you was unconscionable. Yes, Catherine said. It was. But as I searched for the truth, I kept thinking about what your father had told me about you. How brilliant you were. How strong. How you had a mind that could grasp concepts most men struggled with. I thought I was looking for a victim who needed rescue. But the more I learned, the more I realized I was searching for someone remarkable. He moved closer, his blue eyes intense. And then I met you in the library, and I saw that you hadn't been broken. You'd been bending, yes, but not breaking. You were still fighting, still sharp, still entirely yourself, despite everything they'd done to you. Where are you going with this, Your Grace? Richard, he said. Please, call me Richard, and I'm going to a place that's probably too soon, too presumptuous. But I'm 42 years old, and I've never met anyone who made me feel the way you do. So I'm going to say it anyway. He took her hand, still rough and scarred from 5 years of labor, but no longer a maid's hand. A duchess's hand that had survived and endured. I love you, he said simply. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw your portrait, and I've been falling ever since. You're everything I never knew I wanted, strong and intelligent and brave in ways I'm not sure I could be. And I know you've just escaped one trap, and the last thing you probably want is someone pressing you about the future. But I need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored beyond measure if you would consent to be my wife. Catherine looked at him, this duke who had fought for her, who had seen her worth when no one else had, who was offering her not rescue but partnership. Ask me again in a year, she said quietly, when I've had time to be myself, to manage this estate, to remember who I am without chains. Ask me when I've proven to myself that I'm choosing you because I want you, not because I need you. A year, he said, his expression easing into something like relief. I can wait a year. I've waited 42 years to find you. What's one more? But, Richard, she said, and smiled. The first real smile she'd allowed herself in 5 years. I'm fairly certain I'm going to say yes, just so you know. He laughed, and the sound was warm and real. And then he was kissing her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. 5 years of loneliness and determination, melting into this moment of connection and promise. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. Your Grace, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You are extraordinary. I know, Catherine said. And for the first time in 5 years, she believed it. 1 year later, spring 1860, the gardens of Ashworth Abbey blazed with color, newly restored under Catherine's careful management. The estate was flourishing again. Tenants' cottages repaired, farms properly managed, the house brought back to its former glory. Catherine walked through the rose garden that had been her mother's pride, now lovingly resurrected, and felt at peace. She was 26 years old. She'd spent 5 years in hell and 1 year rebuilding heaven. The Duchess of Ashworth in her own right, respected by her peers, beloved by her tenants, and no longer anyone's victim. Richard was coming today. He came every week, had done for the entire year, courting her properly and patiently while she'd reclaimed her life. They'd talked about books and law, estate management and politics. They'd argued. Catherine's mind was too sharp and her opinions too strong for her to simply agree with everything. And Richard had loved her more for it. She saw his carriage coming up the drive, and her heart lifted. 12 months ago, she'd asked him to wait a year. That year was over. Richard found her in the rose garden, and when he saw her face, he smiled. "Ask me," Catherine said. He didn't need her to explain. He took her hand, went down on one knee in the grass, and said, "Catherine Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth in your own right, the strongest and most brilliant woman I've ever known, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life earning the privilege of standing beside you?" "Yes," Catherine said. "Yes to all of it. To marriage, to partnership, to building a life together. But Richard, you understand what you're getting. I'm not going to be a conventional duchess. I'm going to manage my estate. I'm going to speak my mind. I'm going to be exactly who I am." "I'm counting on it," he said, rising and pulling her into his arms. "I don't want conventional. I want you." They were married in June in the chapel at Ashworth Abbey. Half the peerage attended, curious to see the duchess who'd returned from the dead and claimed her inheritance. Society buzzed with gossip, but Catherine didn't care. She'd stopped caring what they thought somewhere during year 3 of scrubbing floors. Harriet was living in reduced circumstances in Brighton, her fraud exposed, her false marriage revealed. She'd returned most of the stolen money to avoid prosecution, and society had closed its doors to her completely. Justice, Catherine thought, wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply the truth coming to light, and everyone seeing clearly at last. 5 years later, 1865, Catherine sat in her father's study, her study where she managed her vast estate with the same competence her father had shown, and reviewed the day's correspondence. Beside her, in a basket by the fire, her daughter slept, Margaret Catherine Blackwood, 3 months old, who would inherit both the Ashworth and Thornfield estates someday. Her son, 2-year-old Edmund, named for her father, was with his nurse, no doubt causing cheerful havoc somewhere in the nursery wing. Richard came in, carrying a newspaper. "You made the Times again. The Duchess of Ashworth's innovative agricultural reforms have increased yields by 30% while improving worker conditions. They're calling you a model for modern estate management. They called me a scandal when I married you," Catherine said dryly. "A woman managing her own estate? Shocking. A duchess who insists on personally reviewing the books? Unseemly. Now they're pretending they supported me all along. That's politics." Richard came around the desk and kissed the top of her head. "How are the Yorkshire properties?" "Profitable again, finally. The investment in drainage was worth it." She set down her pen and looked up at him. "Richard, I've been thinking. We should endow a school for girls. Teach them law, mathematics, estate management, all the things Father taught me." "The world might not be ready for that," he said, but he was smiling. "The world wasn't ready for me," Catherine said. "It had to adjust. And if we can give other girls the education I had, perhaps they'll be ready when the world tries to tell them they can't do something." "Then we'll do it," Richard said. "Though I pity any man who tries to tell our daughter she can't manage an estate someday." Catherine smiled. She thought about the girl she'd been, scrubbing floors in her own home, waiting for someone to see her. She thought about the woman she'd become. Strong, capable, certain of her own worth. And she thought about her daughter, who would grow up knowing she was valuable, knowing she was seen, knowing she could be anything she chose to be. "Truth conquers," the Ashworth motto said. Sometimes it took longer than you'd like. Sometimes you had to fight for it with everything you had. Sometimes you had to spend 5 years on your knees before you could stand tall again. But truth conquered. In the end, it always did. Dear listener, we leave Catherine here, happy powerful, surrounded by love and respect, exactly where her father always intended her to be. But before you sleep, I want to speak to you directly, not as a narrator, but as someone who understands why stories like Catherine's matter. If you have ever felt invisible in your own life, know this: your invisibility was never your fault. It was the failure of those who should have seen you. The world sometimes refuses to look at what it doesn't understand or doesn't want to acknowledge. But that doesn't mean you aren't worth seeing. If you have ever been told you were too much, too smart, too ambitious, too certain of your own worth, know this: you were never too much. The world was too small, and anyone who tried to make you smaller was simply afraid of how bright you could shine. If you have ever stayed quiet when you wanted to speak, accepted less than you deserved, made yourself small to comfort others, know this: your patience was not weakness. It was survival, and survival takes extraordinary strength. Catherine survived 5 years of degradation and came out whole. You have survived your own challenges. That survival makes you powerful in ways you may not yet understand. You may be wondering how Catherine endured 5 years of such treatment without breaking. The answer is that she did break, broke and remade herself 100 times over, each time a little stronger, a little more certain of her core self. She survived by holding on to one truth: they could control her circumstances, but they couldn't control who she was inside. Perhaps you have lived through years of being undervalued. Perhaps you have been told that your time has passed, that your worth diminishes with age, that you should be grateful for scraps. Perhaps you have felt like Catherine, scrubbing the floors of your own life while others take credit for your work. But here is what Catherine's story teaches us: worth doesn't diminish. Intelligence doesn't fade. Strength doesn't evaporate simply because the world refuses to acknowledge it. Catherine was always the Duke's daughter, always brilliant, always worthy, even when she was on her knees with a scrubbing brush. Her circumstances changed, but her essential self never did. And the same is true for you. You are not less because someone treated you as unless. You are not diminished because someone tried to diminish you. You are not invisible because someone refused to see you. You are exactly who you have always been: valuable, capable, worthy of respect and love, and every good thing life can offer. If Catherine's story of reclaiming her identity through the knowledge her father gave her resonated with you, perhaps share it with someone who's been told their intelligence is threatening, that their competence is unfeminine, that their strength is unseemly. Sometimes we need to hear that brilliance is not a flaw, that capability is not a character defect, that refusing to be made small is not arrogance. It's simply knowing your own worth. And tell me in the comments, what knowledge or skill do you possess that others have tried to make you hide? What part of yourself have you been told to diminish? I read every response, and your truths shape the stories I choose to tell. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters. You matter. If you'd like more stories about women who refuse to be erased, who use their minds as weapons against injustice, who claimed their rightful places despite every obstacle, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we explore another journey from invisibility to recognition, from injustice to vindication, from loneliness to love. There's always another story waiting, another woman who refused to disappear. And if tonight's story brought you comfort, if Catherine's vindication felt like a little bit of your own vindication, like helps other listeners find their way here too, this is a place for people who've been underestimated, a refuge for people who are tired of being invisible. You belong here. Now, as you drift toward sleep, I want you to imagine something. Imagine someone looking at you the way Richard looked at Catherine. Not at what you've been forced to become, but at who you truly are beneath the roles and expectations and degradations. Someone who sees your intelligence as fascinating, not threatening. Someone who sees your strength as attractive, not unseemly. Someone who looks at your scars, whether physical or emotional, and sees them as proof of survival, not as flaws. That person exists. Perhaps they're already in your life, and you haven't recognized them yet. Perhaps you haven't met them yet. Perhaps, and this is most important, that person is you, finally seeing yourself clearly after years of looking through others' distorted mirrors. But imagine it now as you fall asleep. Imagine someone saying, "I see you. I see exactly who you are, and you're extraordinary." Because you are. Rest now, dear listener. Let this story carry you into dreams where you are, seen completely without judgment or limitation, valued for exactly what you are, free to be your full self without apology, powerful in ways you haven't yet discovered. Exactly where you belong tomorrow is not the end of your story. Tomorrow is simply the next chapter, and like Catherine, you get to decide what that chapter contains. You get to reclaim what was taken. You get to stand tall after years of being forced to bow. You get to say no more to anyone who tries to make you invisible. Your worth is not determined by who sees it. It simply is. Sleep well, knowing you are the heroine of your own story. Sleep well, knowing that truth conquers, even when it takes years. Sleep well, knowing that your value was never in question, only other people's ability to recognize it. Sweet dreams, Your Grace, because that's what you are. Royalty who's been forced to scrub floors, brilliance that's been forced to hide, strength that's been forced to bend. But you were always royalty. You were always brilliant. You were always strong. And tomorrow, you get to start remembering that. Sweet dreams, dear listener. Sweet dreams.